Okay, thank you. So I would like first to thank the organizers for setting this nice program. And I'm afraid I will downscale very, very much for comparing to the previous talks, because we will go down to the atomic scale. And we will see how, based on multi-scale numerical modeling, we can put some constraints on the rheology of the mantle, or trying to do that. This is not the work of the one, so basically this is the team who is involved in this study, and they are here, and you may talk to them during the breaks or at the poster session. So we have the same target as previously, so basically the large-scale picture. We want to understand or to put constraints on mantle convection. This is on the way with matter we can transport heat through the mantle which is heated from inside and from the bottom. And to do that, of course, we have some tools, some modeling tools, which are based basically on fluid mechanics. And to make those models run, what we need is the behavior of the material, of the medium, which is behind. And to give the information about this behavior, we need one important parameter that has been mentioned early by Yannick, which is the viscosity. And this is one simple thing in a one-dimensional problem. This is what we would like to have, what we would dream to have. That is the profile of the evolution of the viscosity as a function of depth. So viscosity relates stress and strain rate. So this is really what gives the behavior of this material, of this fluid. But it's not exactly a fluid, and that's the main problem. We are dealing with a very complex fluid when we deal about mantle convection, which is a solid. So we are dealing with rocks, with solid rocks, which are made of high-pressure phases, for which we have a very limited access, actually, at the surface of the Earth or in experiments. And also, we need to have deformation experiments under complicated conditions. We have high temperatures, but that's not the worst part. We have high pressures, and high pressures, what does it mean? You look like here, the numbers, the figures, this pressure exceeds 100 GPa, and if you think about the elastic constants of those minerals, we are within the same order of magnitude, which means that we can expect pressure to change profoundly the atomic structure or the electronic structure of those materials, so we need really to take this parameter into account at the small scale. And also, last but not least, we have very, very small strain rates. The mantle deform at extremely low strain rates, which are not very easy to observe at the human time scale. And also, this has to be done under very low stresses. So this is something which is an experimental challenge and which is also a theoretical challenge. So let me evoke briefly the experimental approach, because usually what we do is we try to make experiments, so we have to take those high-pressure phases, we have to make them first, and then we have to bring them into the condition of the mantle and apply stress, strain rate, and make plastic deformation. I'm not going to review this part, because it would require more time, but there has been a lot of progress in the last years, in the last, say, 10 years, to make available deformation experiments to study high-pressure phases in some conditions which are relevant for the mantle. Basically, we divide that into two kinds of experiments, what we call large volume experiments. Large volume, it's 1 millimeter or something, it's not so big. But with those experiments which can reach pressure now which are close to the transition zone or at the transition zone, it's possible to make true deformation experiments. That is, that we can monitor independently pressure and deviatoric stress, so we can really perform deformation experiments and get mechanical data from which we can build rheological laws. If we want to go to the lower mantle, of course, pressures are more extreme, and it's more difficult to do that. We rely on this tool, which is a Diamond-Ville cell. But once again, there has been a lot of progress in the last years to get more and more information about the mechanical behavior and the deformation mechanisms of high-pressure phases in those conditions. So let's assume that we do have such kind of experiments and that we get mechanical data, that we get stress and strain rate, for instance, and people like to plot that in this form, to plot the logarithm of the strain rate as the logarithm of stress, And log-log plots are wonderful. So basically, you always end up with a straight line. And from this straight line, you try to build a rheological data, a rheological law, constitutive equations that will relate all the parameters. And you will need those constitutive equations to throw this knowledge to the mantle conditions. So how do we build that? Well, usually we have only empirical way to address that. So let's go for blacksmiths, because blacksmiths know about deformation of materials. And they will guide us to make those constitutive equations. As you can see, blacksmiths are usually strong men, which means that you have a strong influence of stress on plastic deformation. So you incorporate this power law with a stress exponent, which can be 3 to 5 or something like that, which really shows that stress has a strong influence on those mechanisms. And also blacksmiths use fire, so there is the importance of temperature. So you have a thermally activated process. And then you introduce this Arrhenius law here. So having that together, you have the Norton-Hoff constitutive equation that you can use. Then you can make more complicated if you like, and you can introduce an activation volume and everything you like to incorporate all the parameters that you need. But then, the problem remains the same. The problem remains that you need to extrapolate over a large number of orders of magnitude if you want to bring this data that you obtain in the lab to mantle conditions. And that's a problem since, once again, these are empirical relations, and since you don't have a strong physical ground to do this extrapolation. So as you can understand, of course, we try to propose something which is more based on physics. And for that, we need to describe the physics of solid-state flow, because in fact, when you deform a solid, you can deform a crystalline solid. It's not so easy, but you can do that if you have crystal defects. This is really what you have. So for instance, defect like that. There are, in fact, 2 different kinds of models or 2 different kinds of mechanisms by which you can deform crystalline solids. One is just to transport matter from one part of the crystal to another. You do that just by diffusing the atoms, by moving the atoms. And for that, you need point defects, and I think that John will speak about that in an hour or so. And the other possibility is just to shear the crystal and to transport plastic shear. And for that, you need another kind of defects, which are named dislocation, which are linear defects. So this is basically how it works. You progressively shear your crystal by propagating this line that you can see edge on here, and you can see all those lines here in the crystal. So this is what we need to model, and this is basically the goals of this project, is to address the rheology of mantle mineral, of mantle phases. In fact, we just aim at this point to derive intrinsic flow plastic properties of this solid. There are other influences of impurities, grain boundaries, and so on that we will focus on later. But we want to do that based on the physics of plastic deformation and based on multi-scale numerical modeling, and I will explain why we need this multi-scale model. The point is that if we ignore some important things, we address also some important things, and we want to take properly into account the influence of pressure, of temperature, and of strain rate. So this is basically what we dream we can do, and I will show you that we start being able to do that. We like to have a representative volume element in which we put the defects, which are characteristic of a given structure. And then we need to describe the interaction, the collective behavior of all those defects which produce shear, which produce plastic deformation. And then from this kind of calculation, if we describe properly the interaction and evolution of those defects, we can derive this kind of stress, strain, laws, and build up constitutive equations. Okay, so it's not just a dream. We started to do that, and we did that on MgO first for several reasons. MgO is relevant for the lower mantle, where it's alloyed to iron oxide, but also it's a ceramics, so it's available in the laboratory, and there's been a lot of studies, all those dots you can see, a lot of mechanical data which has been obtained in the 70s, for instance. And as you can see here, there are 2 kinds of deformation mechanisms. Let me just describe that briefly. This is the structure of MgO, which is a rock salt structure. There's only one shear direction, which is half 110, but you can, and I will just focus on this parameter, you can shear the crystal either along the basal plane of the cube or along the diagonal plane. Two different kind of mechanisms, but at ambient pressure, very different behaviors. You know, along the basal plane, it's much harder than along the diagonal plane, so usually people in ceramics assume that this is the easiest way to deform this crystal. These are the dots are the experiments I told you, and the line is the result of the model. So that was, if you like, our proof of concept, and we wanted to show that we were able to predict something that we knew, the behavior of MgO. I would like to emphasize that this multi-scale model starts from the atomic scale, from the electronic structure, and there's no adjustable parameter into that, so it's really a reprediction of the model. How do we do that? We need actually 3 steps, and we need to work at different scales to make this kind of model. First, we need to model the defect, and we need to model that at the atomic scale. And I will try to explain you why we really need to go all the way down to the atomic scale to undergo this kind of modeling. Then we want to model the way they move, because the way they move, the kinetics of the motion, propagation of shear determines the mechanical properties. And this mobility depends strongly on stress and temperature, conjugate influence of both. And then we need to take into account the collective behavior of all those defects to get constitutive equation, flow laws that could be used then to make large-scale convection models. Let me try to explain you why we need to go down to the atomic scale. This is basically a schematic of a dislocation. The dislocation is a line defect which glides into this plane and which propagates shear during glide. Okay, so usually we assume it's a defect, but just imagine that this line is not exactly a line, but that it spreads a little bit into the glide plane. It makes a small ribbon. In that case, you know, these are very tiny things. It can be 10 nanometers or something like that. But in that case, we change very, very much the mobility of the defect. Since it spreads into this plane, it can move very easily and much faster into this plane. And also, as a consequence, it will have much more difficulties to move in any other plane. So this kind of details at the atomic scale, just close to the dislocation line, have strong implication on the mobility and hence on the mechanical properties, but also on the geometry of slip. Plastic deformation is a very anisotropic property, and if you go at the other end, you know, you will find a texture, crystal preferred orientation, and seismic anisotropy, which might be eventually controlled by this ability of the defect to move in one or the other plane. So this is very important. So how can we understand if the defect will be able to spread a little bit into a given plane or not? For that, we can make calculations which are at the scale of the unit cell. And we calculate, you can see, but this is written generalized stacking fault, okay? And we make this kind of calculation where we take a crystal structure at the scale of the unit cell, we shear it of a given vector and calculate the extra energy associated to this shear. And so doing that, we can map the easiness or difficulty of shearing a crystal structure. And you can find, you know, what we assume from the ceramic people. We can find, again, that the easy slip or shear path here is half 110, for instance, or here you have the other shear path. What's the advantage of doing that? It's not to find again what we knew. Because we can do that on a limited number of atoms, we can do that by first principles, so we can take properly into account the influence of pressure and of the change of the electronic structure as a function of pressure. So this is a way to do that properly. And this may have some implications, and let me show you the example of MgO, which shows that in this case, this has some implications. I just show here, you know, not the whole surface, but just the profile, and I will just compare those two profiles here. This is what you have here, and once again, this is what everybody knew, that it's more easy to shear the crystal of MgO along the diagonal plane, and we reconstructed the dislocation core, and we found out that it's because the dislocation is lying into this plane. Okay. But when we increase pressure, because we change profoundly the electronic structure, we see that both increase, but not at the same rate. So eventually there's a crossover, and eventually at high pressures, it's more simple, more easy to shear the crystal along the basal plane and not along the diagonal plane. And the structure of the defect changes, and now the dislocation which was spreading here is changing and spreading into the other plane, and it will move into the other plane, and we completely change the geometry of slip of this material. So this is a profound effect of pressure on the mobility of those dislocations. And so doing that, I will explain later how we got the temperature, but we can plot for pressure relevant of the mantle, there's the various regions where one or the other deformation mechanism is active. Okay, so this is what we did on MgO. Of course, we want to apply that to other mineral, and of course, the main target is magnesium silicate perovskite. First, we did perform in 2004 experiments where we deformed in the multi-envir apparatus magnesium silicate perovskite, but that was at conditions at the very top uppermost lower mantle, but we could characterize some dislocations. This is an orthorhombic crystal in that case. It's not the same structure as previously, but just remember those two figures here, 1,0,0 dislocation and 0,10 dislocation seem to be important, at least in these conditions. Can we expect that we have same changes as we observed in MgO? Is it relevant for the whole mantle or not? So we are starting some calculation on the magnesium silicate perovskite. I will not say too much about that, and I invite you to see Antoine's poster this afternoon, where he will describe the first results that we're having on this structure. I just quickly show you that we start now to have the possibility to calculate, to model the defects in this structure, which is more complicated than MgO, and you understand now that you will focus on this ribbon here, and you will look how narrow or wide this spreading is occurring, because this has implications, mechanical properties, and he and Karine will explain how they can apply stress on the simulation box and how they can make those dislocations move and get data about the mechanical properties. This is the other dislocation. This is a 0,10, and you can see that here two, let's say, atomic rows or two layers are involved in the structure of the detail. One more time, you may have the detail this afternoon. I won't spend more time about that. I would like to explain now briefly, very briefly, how we take into account the influence of temperature. Because there's a big theoretical challenge to understand how this kind of defect move, because they involve such a large number of atoms. So you can just not rely on simple statistical physics and wait that you have a configuration that will jump over an energy barrier from one position to another. So we need to understand, we need to invent some mechanisms by which a dislocation will progressively, and this is what operates, we call that the king pair mechanism. We need to understand how a dislocation line will throw a small loop over the barrier, which will pull the rest of the dislocation, and then the dislocation will have moved from one step. So this kind of mechanism we can describe. It's not exactly at the atomic scale. We're just going at the upper scale, because we need to describe collective motion of atoms. But I won't go into the details, of course, but we can calculate the frequency of attempts of such an event, which is not at the frequency of atomic vibrations, so there is a challenge in the calculation to do that. We can calculate the number of sites. This W is the width of this loop, so the size, the characteristic size of this loop, and we can calculate the probability of a successful jump, and having that together, we can build a mobility law for the dislocation, a velocity law for the dislocation. Once again, I don't want to go into the details, but I want to attract your attention on the fact that stress is inside, but not as a simple power law. Stress determines the geometry of the critical defects, and stress affects the energy barrier, but it's inside. So we have the mixed influence of stress and of strain rate. If we look at the the shape of this law, and if we make the same log-log plot, you know, this is the velocity of a single dislocation, this is stress, you can see that it's bending, it's not a straight line, it does not behave as a power law. Of course, in a limited range of stress, you can have this straight portion, but if you extrapolate, of course, the extrapolation will be different, so we need to take that into account. How do we go to the next scale? Well, we have to understand how those individual properties mix to go to the actual physical property that we see at the macroscopic scale. We can start here at 0 Kelvin, where we don't have temperatures. We just have to use brutal force and to push on the dislocation. We call that the pile stress. But as soon as we add temperature, we have this interplay between stress and temperature. This is what we call the thermally activated regime. And in that case, it's quite easy because basically the dislocation struggles with the lattice, and we can just add linearly the contributions of each dislocation. This is what we call the Orovon law. This is the number of dislocation, if you like, the amount of shear, and the velocity of the dislocation. And from that, we can derive an apparent viscosity. So that's fine. But at a given point, you know, the thermal activation is enough so that the dislocation moves freely. And then we reach a plateau, and we call that the ephemeral regime. And it's a little bit more complicated because now the velocity of the dislocation doesn't matter. What matters is when they are stopped, entangled, when they form junctions. So now it's just a microstructure which will control the plastic behavior. So there's no temperature dependence anymore, and either no strain rate dependence. So this is, we cannot derive a viscosity. Sometimes people are puzzled about that, but this is just a plastic solid, so there's no big mystery about that. Okay, the good point is that we have this law, but with the possibility to incorporate strain rate, so we can make deformation maps where the strain rate is obvious, and when we can see the influence of strain rate. So let me just emphasize those two regimes, this thermally activated regime where it's viscous, and this ephemeral regime where it's plastic, and the boundary in between, you have strain rates here. This is conditions of, I would say, the laboratory. This is the mantle, and we can see how this changes the deformation mechanisms. This is basically what people knew from material science, that as long as you heat up, you have a weak plastic solid with MgO, and it's not very surprising. But as soon as you apply pressure, it changes very much. Pressure strengthens the bonds, and then you know you have MgO which has a completely different behavior. It's much stronger, and you are deeper and deeper and deeper as you increase pressure into the thermally activated regime. On the contrary, well, the decreasing strain rate enhances the high temperature mechanisms. And basically, the mantle remains in a completely different regime. So we really have to transfer what we can observe at this time scale to the natural time scale. It's only in this calculation at about 2,300 kilometers at 100 GPa that we start touching this thermally activated regime. So I may change the view, and just to illustrate, I'm not aiming at being realistic, but just to illustrate how it can affect the mantle in this simple one-dimensional model, we've seen that we have heterogeneities, and we could really play and put that into heterogeneities and see how it works. But just into this simple model, we can expect that it's only in some parts of the deeper mantle that MgO will exhibit really a viscosity. Otherwise, it will be in the ephemeral regime. Let me just zoom in briefly into this domain to see how it works. You remember the colors in the plots previously. You know, when we went going deeper into this thermally activated regime, it was becoming more and more nonlinear. I can come back to that. You know, this color was related to the apparent stress exponent that we plotted just to make the link with empirical equations. So when you go deeper into this thermally activated regime, it becomes more and more nonlinear. It can be highly nonlinear. So if you have this loop here, when you go a little bit into this thermally activated regime, you can see this nonlinearity, because then, you know, the viscosity that we could calculate here, the viscosity depends on the strain rate. So this is something that you can see. And when we are close to this boundary, the behavior is much more linear. Okay, just an illustration, but we can go further in this respect. So let me conclude now. I hope that I convince you that we have, with multi-scale numerical modeling, now the possibility to address actually this complex property, which is plastic deformation, taking into account conditions which are relevant of the mantle, pressure because we start from first principle and because we describe the electronic structure, but also, and that's most important, the strain rate, which is a huge theoretical challenge for this field. And for instance, the first results that we got on MGO showed that there are some strong effect of pressure, and for instance, the change in slip systems as a function of pressure, but there are also some strong effect of the strain rate, which strongly emphasizes the high temperature deformation mechanisms as compared to pressure, which enhances the low temperature deformation mechanism. So there is really a trade-off between strain rate and pressure, if you like, in the mantle. We're just starting on MG SiO3 perovskite, and you can see once again some results this afternoon. It seems from this first result that the slip systems, and you will see that on the poster, it seems that the slip system that we inferred by some experiments at conditions just at the top of the lower mantle may prevail down to the core mantle boundary, but this is to be confirmed. So having said that, I will stop and thank you very much.